right, everybody, welcome to the Middle Ground Mike. We've got a really awesome guest here today, David from the Outrage Overload podcast. He definitely has some great content. We seem to share some similar thought process, so I appreciate you for being on here.
Yeah, I really appreciate you having me on, Joseph.
Yeah, as like I was telling you earlier, I think that we need more middle of the road, trying to meet the middle area on a lot of these things, or at least getting people who don't agree to be able to civilly disagree.
Right. I mean, I think, we're so tuned now, we're so trained, and the way we look at everything, we immediately want to put everything in a sort of blue-red lens, left-right lens. We immediately want to sort of, well, who did this thing, right? It's not a matter of what they did, it's a matter of like who did it. And we just are so quick to put everything in that through that lens. And it's not helping us. Like, it's not helping us get anywhere to do that. So that's one of my missions, is try to get us to look past that to some degree, try to be more realistic about it, and be critical of your own side. Like, whatever side you seem more have an affinity toward, that's the side you need to be more critical about, because we just tend to accept anything that our side says, and we don't look too critically at it. And it doesn't give us a good picture of the world when we do that.
Yeah, I openly admit, I voted for the current president, not because I necessarily liked everything. There's just certain things that I liked that he wanted to go after. Growing up in Detroit, the only thing I've heard my whole life is China and Mexico are taking our jobs. NAFTA's terrible. Boom, boom, boom. I mean, it's like in this town, talking points. I mean, like, you go to the local, well, we call them Coney Islands here, but it's more like a family diner. You go there, you drink coffee some morning, you hear somebody somewhere, probably at least once while you're there, talk about somebody like Mexico or China taking their manufacturing jobs, right? So Trump's like, hey, I'm going to take the terrorists to task. And I know that makes like things more expensive in short term and things of that nature. No argument there. But, I've lived watching, this area even after, the 60s, 70s, 80s, the thousands, they call it the lost decade here. The pretty much the automakers were in the dust, left for dead. Their own doing, right, with their business practices. But everything was just shutting down. And I remember 2008, you were lucky to even get a job around here at a gas station part-time. And that was just that you're just sitting there and you're going, man, that's just wild, And so, that's kind of like why I had voted for him a little bit. But, I'm still critical of some of the things he does. Like I didn't agree with the Iran strike. I felt wasn't our place. I wish he would, when it comes to immigration, I wish he would take a little bit more of the Ronald Reagan approach. If you're here peacefully, we're going to find a way to keep you here, get you on the payrolls. If you're violent, crazy, you got to go. That worked really well for Ronald Reagan. And I think, even Trump had kind of alluded to, he was open to it for, hospitality and farming. And then I don't know what happened, but 24 hours later, changed his mind again.
Yeah.
So, because I mean, there's, I work in the QSR industry, quick service industry, and there's just a lot of people who don't want to do certain jobs anymore, which is fine, right? I mean, we've almost doubled our wages over 5 years, and people will still go take a job that pays $2 less an hour, so they don't have to do that, So like, when it comes to, obviously in that, it's a lot more about atmosphere than anything, but, I wish our current president would see that, some immigrants do offer a lot of value. And if they, like Hillary had even said, hey, make them pay a fine, like essentially, back pay, you got to give us some back pay for being here. We need more funding to go into Social Security. We need more funding to go into Medicare and Medicaid to help keep them solvent. Well, you got a couple million people you could slap on the payrolls and start putting funding into it.
Yeah, I mean, these are definitely hard problems. I mean, one thing I've learned about doing my show now for a couple of years is, I think I'm a lot less, like I'm certain about things, like in the sense that, oh, maybe I don't know as much about that as I thought I did. Once you start talking to some experts and learn more about it, but yeah. And I think, one thing you talk about Detroit, and I think, and this isn't really a thing that we talk about a lot on our show, but it's relevant from sort of political science perspective for sure. And even everything else that, I mean, I think, I think both parties, but I think the Democrats in particular have really just wanted to pretend that things were going good because it was going good, in sort of California and San Francisco, and it's going good in New York, and it's going good, in some of these other tech hubs around the country and things like that. It's not going so good in a whole bunch of the middle America and rural America. And I think that, I think they paid a price for that with Trump. I think they, twice. I think they paid a price with that in general. And I don't think they've really yet appreciated that. And maybe the guy in New York, the Mandani guy, is
Yeah, I'm terrified.
sort of an indication of that too. Like at least he's saying stuff to people that are hurting. Like they're saying, yeah, I see that you're hurting. I think for a long time Democrats were sort of sending this message, you're not hurting. Look at the stock market. Oh, you must not be
Right.
hurting.
Yeah.
And people are hurting. And I think that's, and that puts us in jeopardy, that not acknowledging that. And, none of these problems have a quick fix or an easy fix. And also a lot of these problems, presidents can't do as much as we unless they sort of break the rules. And if you look at some of the presidents that have broken the rules over the past, you might call FDR one of those. You might call Lincoln one of those. Those presidents have sort of been popular, but they kind of broke some rules. They weren't necessarily doing it the normal American way. And so sometimes we've had, or for a long time now, we've had presidents promise a lot of things that they kind of can't deliver unless they can get Congress on board with it. And even more, sort of a larger segment of the population kind of on board with it to really execute it and follow through. Because even if laws pass, sort of nothing happens if people don't do the work to make it happen. And I think this is where we're in a big mess now, is that everybody sort of thinks the other side is the problem and that there's some quick fix, and it's not. It's going to require us to sit down with people we don't necessarily like that well, or we don't necessarily agree with, and come up with, well, what are the things we both agree with we want to fix, whether it's some potholes here or whether it's some healthcare there or whether it's something. And like, our constituencies, if we're a politician, are like telling us not to do that. Like, oh no, you're not allowed to talk to the other side. Like you can't sit down with them. But that's the only way we're going to get stuff done.
Yeah, it can almost cost you an election these days.
It can totally cost you an election. You can get primaried, whatever we want to call it, right? And it's terrible. And I blame us. Like we're the people pushing that. Like we have to get better at saying, no, you need to go, because we all seem to live in this fantasy land that somehow our side will dominate. Like we're going to win enough seats in the House and in the Senate that the other side won't matter. Like we'll have, when has that been true? Like you're in the 60s, that was true. It hasn't been true for a long time, maybe the 70s for a little bit, but it hasn't been true for a long time. These elections and the majorities, these slim majorities in the House and Senate, and even in state legislatures, other than, you obviously have states that lean one way or the other, but even there aren't that many that have what they call super majorities. So we have to figure out how to work together, because it's just not going to happen the other way. We'll just constantly be in these fights. We'll be arguing the other side's the problem. And meanwhile, we get screwed. Meanwhile, whether you're left or right or red or blue or wherever you stand, we're all getting screwed.
Right. Yeah. Something that I was talking to my son about, he's 15, he's in high school. And I said, have they taught you about the Great Compromise yet? And he just looks at me, he's like, what? I'm like, that's why we're a country. It's called the Great Compromise. Granted, it probably, in hindsight, wasn't the greatest compromise in the world, right? But a bunch of people that probably under any other situation would have went to war with each other, found a way to go, okay, hey, yeah, we'd rather make a go out of this on our own. And if we have to shoot each other, we'll shoot each other. But we don't want England shooting us first. And because the South back then would have easily warred with the North if we didn't have an uprising against England. That's just my opinion.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of experts and historians talk about that basically this whole, and I think we don't learn this enough in like early civics, and like, those founding fathers didn't necessarily like each other, right?
No.
I mean, they had some very different views about things, and the whole founding of this country was more or less a bunch of compromises, right? I mean,
Yes.
like you say, there's sort of what they call the Great Compromise, but there's the whole Constitution, the whole forming of the country is more or less a bunch of compromises. And, and it's not just two factions. You don't just sort of have the North and South. You have other factions in there. And you can kind of carve them up and give them different kinds of labels, but you definitely didn't just have two factions. You had more than two factions, and people with very different views, and they did not like each other. And yet, we somehow formed this country, and to some extent, we still live with that. Like we still are struggling with that in some way, because it's still not a reality we want to accept. We don't want it to be that way, because those conversations, when you have to be in a room with people you don't agree with, and sometimes you don't even like, are really hard. Like that's really hard. But that's also in America, that's how stuff gets done. That's the only way stuff gets done. You notice this, it's easier to notice locally because it's sometimes easier to find a mission we want to get together on. Like, yeah, we really don't want that stoplight down at that place, or we need to upgrade this crosswalk, or we, and we can all sort of get on the same page about that. And then people get in a room that don't necessarily agree about a whole bunch of stuff, but we're aligned on this idea that we want to solve this one problem. And that's how things get done. And also that's how things get better for the next time, because now you spent time with those people. You realize, okay, well, I don't like all their politics, but you know what? I mean, they have kids. They want good schools for their kids. Do we agree about everything about how to do that? No, but we want a whole bunch of the same things. They're normal people. Like, they're just trying to get by, just like I am. Whereas usually we very quickly just assume these people are evil and dumb and stupid and all these attributes to them because they're not looking at the world right.
Yeah, the one of the things I was like, speaking of education, it's ironic, when people are talking about, hey, he wants to gut the Department of Education, and I get where the concerns can come from. But he's not wrong when he says, hey, well, before the federal government really started sticking its nose in, our kids were better educated. And I think that is something that I think that's a reality that people got to be willing to look at and go, okay, maybe the people in Michigan know how to teach people in Michigan a little bit better than Washington D.C. thinks, because dialects are different. I might say fries different than you do.
Yeah. What do you call a soft drink? I guess even soft drink is giving it away a little bit. But what do you call a soft drink where you live?
We technically call it pop.
You guys call it pop. Like, we usually call it sort of soda out here, right? And
Okay.
I think like around the country, people call it different things. Some people call it a pop. Some people, it's funny how those, and you can really tell these differences.
Oh yeah, in the South, I believe they tend to call everything Coke.
Yeah, I think they do call
They just
everything
get a
Coke.
Coke.
Yeah.
And it's crazy. So I think I'm more for like the federalist system. Obviously, you can't go to the hardcore system like they had 200 years ago. It just doesn't apply to a country the size of ours.
Right. I mean, there are,
It's not a
yeah.
reality. The one thing that I've talked about a couple times on my podcast is where the 17th Amendment is where I really feel like I get the purpose of it. It was when they changed the Senate from being appointed by the states to being popularly elected. And I get why back then, corruption it was a whole lot harder to find corruption than it is now. Back then, the reason why I say that is so that, to me, the House of Representatives represents the people, right? That's why they call it the people's house, quote unquote. And then when you look, Senate or state governments are a lot more efficient, right? And they address problems a lot faster than the federal government. Even if it's not the greatest state government, they tend to be a little bit more in tune with their population and where they want to go with things. So in my thought process is, a lot of people have concerns about health, just like regular citizens, healthcare, this, that, the other thing. Well, those concerns tend to be reflected by your state government. Like the governors will run on that. They try to take action on that. Well, if the state governments were appointing the senators, they're going to appoint senators that are going to try to go after very similar things. And those senators, to me, are going to be more inclined to get something done with the House, because the perspectives are going to start to align a little bit more rather than being so split, because it's all about, well, if I do this, my donor's going to back out next campaign.
Yeah, and again, this is sort of an example of those. I very rarely go out in public and start telling everybody I think I have all the answers to our problems.
Oh, yeah.
But so like I say, I very quickly realize how complicated a lot of this stuff is. But yeah, when it comes to that, that's sort of an example of how we've kind of nationalized so much of our politics, right? And I think, okay, our big factor there is kind of the reduction of local journalism too, right? Where there was more, the old fourth estate idea, the whole idea that their journalists are kind of holding politicians accountable and stuff like that. Well, now without that local journalism, everybody's kind of getting their news from sort of the same 7 places. So of course it's all kind of national news. So we don't even know that much about what's happening locally, which is probably the stuff that impacts us 10 times more than this stuff that's happening nationally, right? And I think that's an example of that, like you say, where the Senate now is back to sort of focusing on federalized national issues. Like, they don't have to answer to their own area as much, right? I mean, you could make that argument. Am I wrong?
Yeah. No, yeah,
Could someone probably make the counter argument, and I'd be like, oh, maybe I was wrong about that. But I've definitely seen that argument made.
Yeah, I mean, it's easiest, like we have here in Michigan, we have Gary Peters. Gary Peters has done a lot of good things for Michigan, but there's also a lot of things when I look at it, it just kind of seems like more he's focused on obstructing it because it's a Republican doing it. rather than, just, hey, I'm Gary Peters from Michigan. Like, it's like, hey, Gary, you're coming out talking about the tariffs, but, when the current president wasn't in there and Biden was in there, well, you didn't push him to reduce any of the previous
Yeah.
tariffs. You're only, my issue with it is he only has an issue with it because it's the other side doing it. And it's like, hey, man, that's the reason why we can't get nothing done. If we all agree that certain things a problem, like I like to always use the reference of Tip O'Neill and Ronald Reagan. They had dinner together frequently. I think at one point weekly, something of that nature, and political enemies essentially, right? But they understood each other as men. They understood each other as leaders. So when they needed to get something done, they were able to kind of finagle things, right? And kind of, well, do this, you do this, I do that. Ronald Reagan was able to accomplish a lot of what he did, even if you like or disagree with it, but he was able to accomplish that with the opposite party being in control of the House of Representatives. Now, to get that level of things done, it would be impossible.
You can't even get your things done barely when you have the majority. Even then, it's hard, right? Because there's so much partisan fighting, and then there's, of course, infighting in each party.
Yeah, and you were talking about the media. So I had a friend who worked in, essentially it was kind of like business support for commercials. And I was talking to him, and it was an election cycle. And we're talking back and forth, and he goes, why all the news stations can get away with lying to you, right? And I was like, no. He goes, they're not registered as news stations; they're registered as entertainment corporation. So they can twist it, barely tell the truth, or not even tell the truth, and there's no consequence because it's entertainment. And then most of our media is owned by 3, 4, maybe 5 companies in this country. He said it's literally all just like this. He goes, they essentially changed all their incorporations to entertainment, so that way they can twist things in a way to where they're not as responsible as they would be if they had to just be focused on pure journalism.
Yeah, I mean, the media landscape is definitely a challenge. I mean, and I think it's under a big upheaval continuing, right? I mean, this has been ongoing, but I think there's another sort of wave of it happening now. And you're seeing a lot of independent journalists or former, national journalists or big publication journalists going independent, either getting fired because they said something that people thought they weren't supposed to say, or otherwise going out on their own. And I think there's going to be a wave of this, and it's going to be it's already challenging to find good quality information. And I have a relationship with the Connors Institute out of Shippensburg University, and and like Lawrence Eppard there, I've had him on the show a few times, and they talk about how, on the one hand, we've probably got more quality journalism than we've ever had, right? But at the same time, we have more bad journalism too. And sorting those out and trying to finding them and figuring out which one is which is a huge challenge. Like, even if you're good at it, even if you do that, even if you go to journalism school and you spend a bunch of time at it, it can still be really hard. Like, the good stuff looks about the same as the bad stuff. It's kind of in the same font. It's got nice pictures. It's laid out well, this kind of stuff. Sometimes it's even written well, and so it can be a really heavy lift for news consumers. And that's the ones that want to do it. I mean, the thing about Americans, if we, for guys like you and me that spend some time doing this, and we look at the news, we're all out here, oh, the problem is the news media sort of not being high quality or lying to us or whatever. Well, most people couldn't care less because they're not even paying attention to the news anyway, right? If anything, they're getting copies of that stuff in their social media feeds and stuff like that, or they're hearing about it from friends. And so we're out here just so worried about the news consumption and the news quality. In some sense, most people aren't even caring at all. So maybe we'll start caring more as we begin to suffer from not caring. I don't know. I don't know how that's going to play out, but yeah, it's a big problem. And even if you want to do it, it's hard. And the problem is most people don't want to do it. Most people kind of want the information that helps them feel like they've already have the right answer, and they just are looking for the information that feeds that, and helps them feel good about what they already believe.
Well, I think two big points that like essentially highlight that, prove that, right, is Chris Cuomo and I think I said his last name right, and Chuck Todd. Since they've left CNN and MSNBC, they've all pretty much said, both of them said, well, I was kind of just saying what I was told to say. Didn't really believe what I was saying. I mean, they've said it in so many words. I mean, Chuck Todd has come out and, I mean, he's still a Democrat, right? But with the way he's come out against Biden, you would think he was a right Republican with his. But when he was when he was with MSNBC, he was like, "Oh no, Biden, just the greatest thing ever." And now he's like, "Man, this guy's selfish. He had no idea what was going on." And it's like, man, like, if you could have just stood on that when you were, you know, in there, we would have been, to me, better off. I used to like MSNBC back in the day, and then it just kind of seemed to get a little bit more like one sided compared to, like, I think to me 15, 20 years ago, they were a little bit more mixed. Now it seems to be heavy.
Well, and I do want to say, I think Chuck Todd was technically with NBC News, which is not the same as MSNBC.
I thought it was MSNBC. My apologies.
And these lines are getting thinner and thinner. Although I know NBC is trying to at some point wants to spin off MSNBC, so they are trying to draw that line a little sharper. But yeah, I mean, theoretically, NBC News would be more, I don't know, less partisan, a little bit more. But yeah, again, they fit in that left leaning news circle for sure, but not as much as I would say MSNBC does.
Oh yeah, well, I mean, CNN's pretty much just, if there was a left like umbrella, they pretty much just go and stand under it. But to be fair though, during the election, I was kind of tuning in, flipping around during the election night. Granted, a lot of their hosts and commentators were like, "Oh my god," but I will give them credit; they were as fair as they could be about it. I didn't, they had their opinions against president, things like that, but they didn't sit there. It was like they were reporting on what was coming across.
Yeah, exactly. And they've had a couple waves of trying to move more to the right and be more centrist, and it hasn't been super successful. But who knows? I mean, it's hard to say how what these are all going to go. And I think News Nation, I think like you're talking about with Cuomo, is
yes, I like them a little bit.
is kind of, because they have stuff on there that's more like that. I mean, they have The Hill on there, which tends to be a little bit more centrist, or at least more neutral. I say neutral isn't the right word, because you can't be neutral, and you can't also be nonpartisan. It's kind of impossible, because we just have our brains and we're humans, so we're always going to be a bit partisan. But they can still put in the effort. They can still try to be more balanced, and you can do things even if. But I always worry about even saying nonpartisan, because to some degree that's impossible. We can't do it, but we can certainly make the attempt.
Yeah, and it's there. We just got to try.
Yeah, and it helps to have people that can check you, right? I mean, if you have folks that have different perspectives than you in your network, people talk about, like you mentioned at the beginning, like one of the things, it was actually part of this was kind of a driver for what even caused me to start my show a couple of years ago. You said at the beginning, like you voted for Trump. Okay, for a lot of people, that would be like, well, I'm not going to talk to you anymore. I'm going to block you. I'm going to unfriend you. You're not invited to my household anymore. This kind of stuff, right? And you saw that going on, right? And we saw that going on with 2016, and we saw that going on during COVID times. We saw things like that, like if you support one thing or you don't support one thing, whatever it might be, we're enemies now, and you're not invited. You're not I'm going to block you. I'm going to cancel you from my life, whatever. And of course, you're seeing this kind of stuff even more. And I always see that and say, like, that's the opposite of what we have to do, right? If you have a friend who votes differently than you, keep that friend in your circle. You're not going to necessarily convince them one way or the other. They're not going to convince you one way or the other. That's not necessarily the point, but understand where they're coming from. Understand that they're a regular person with family and problems and all the same things that you have, like just like we all have.
A lot of the same issues.
And even if we don't have the same issues about politics, we sort of have the same issues about life. Like we have family and friends and kids and all that stuff. And then sometimes we'll probably agree about issues too, or at least we can understand each other a little better. And like, I can see where you're coming from. Like, no, I don't agree. I can see where you're coming from. But, and so I always, and so I think exactly where this all started, but, talking about, that idea that we need talk about checking ourselves in our partisanship, right? Those kind of friends can help you do that. Like, I read this thing and it said this, and that sounds really bad. And then they'll be like, well, okay, yeah, it sounds pretty bad, but also, and I'm not talking whataboutism, but I'm like, well, here's how I see it. I saw this happen or that happen. And, and I read it like this. Or maybe they can say, hey, it sounds like you're kind of overreacting to that thing. Like, here's why I don't think it's as bad as you think it is. And so, if you don't have those relationships, you only have your circle that already agrees with you to say, yeah, you're right. That's really bad. You should even be madder about this, right? So, when I talk about outrage overload, sometimes our biggest outrage sources are the people on our side, that we kind of see as on our side.
Yeah. The irony of that, that I voted for the president is I'd probably say a good chunk of my friends, if not 70, 80%, are liberals. And we have had some definitely some heated, not like putting each other down, but definitely some heated, hey, da da da, they feel one way or the other, and you know, but I found that like I've been able to, I would say like quote unquote connect with liberals, right? But I don't have as hard of a time talking to them as some of conservative friends that I have, where they're just like no. And then I had one conservative friend, his name was Don, and I told him I was very critical of how I felt that January 6th was handled, regardless of any conspiracies. I just didn't like how it was handled, right? And he automatically goes, "Oh well, you're a liberal, left wing," and I'm like, I don't have to like everything that someone does. I can like the basic principle, but I told him, I said, I felt a 3 hour wait before you're responding to it was a little long when you're the president of the United States and people are occupying your capital. Maybe not occupying. They're essentially it wasn't just to sit there and watch the vote. You know, that was the idea, but it kind of it went haywire. I think it was when things got swept up and it went the wrong way. But I didn't like that, and I was very critical of the president of that, and there's been other things, right? But he was just like, "Oh, well, you're just a left-wing liberal that just says," and I'm like, "Okay, buddy,
Well, that's basically an example of kind of what we talked about at the very opening,
yeah,
right? It's like, you post something, I disagree with the Supreme Court decision, right? And just independently, you don't say I'm Democrat, I'm Republican, whatever I am. But if that Supreme Court decision was sort of partisan and you voted one way or the other, they're going to say, well, then therefore, yeah, you're like a lefty commie, whatever, right? Or you must be a right-wing fascist or whatever, because you agreed or disagreed with that. And it's just like, that's just where our heads are now. We just assume, and we're getting shown these caricatures of people that are in lockstep, on their side, their tribes, positions on all these issues. And one thing I've learned about this show and all the practitioners that work in this space and try to, sort of bring people together and get people talking to each other and this kind of stuff. One thing I've learned is that is not representative of real people. I mean, that's kind of this caricature that we see on social media, because there's a lot of those kind of people kind of dominate the social media landscape. So we think that's like they dominate in real life. They don't. They dominate sometimes loud with the loudest voices, but they don't dominate in terms of the numbers. I mean, there's this whole idea of this exhausted majority that's, I don't know, 80%, 60%, you can kind of play around with these numbers of how big it is, but there's this exhausted majority that are tired of those people on both sides, right? I mean, they're sick and tired of the people just assuming, if you say one thing, you're left, commie lefty, or if you say one thing, you're a fascist righty. And obviously that's not real people. Like, real people have cross-cutting ideas, and it's okay not to necessarily be in lockstep with your so-called whichever tribe you might sort of feels like you're more aligned with, and it's tough because it's a courageous thing to say, I don't agree with my tribe on these, three things, or I don't even know how I feel maybe about this fourth one. Like, I haven't researched it enough to have an opinion on it. Like, even that's a hard thing to say, right? Like, oh no, you must know this is terrible because the other people like it. You must hate it or whatever, right?
for a long time I thought I was more of a libertarian. I was 13. I don't know if you've ever heard of Thomas Sowell.
Oh yeah.
He's a, I mean, I love his writings. I love the way the guy thinks. But the one thing that I learned as I grew up and experienced life a little bit more is, while the libertarian ideal is great in principle, it relies on the fact that everybody will always do the right thing regardless because it's the easy thing to do. And I was like, man, that's just not real.
Right.
We would all like it to be, but it's just not. I mean, I think libertarians do have a place in our political system. I mean, if anything, they should be like a 10% of Congress and be on the budget boards. I think you'd find a whole lot less pork in the bills if you had libertarians controlling the oversight of spending. I think that they can play a part, right? So, but where I found that economically, I guess you could say, lean definitely a little bit more conservative, but there is definitely some liberal tendencies I have in certain areas. But socially, I'm fairly liberal socially. I mean, go by the otage of do what you do as long as you don't bother me or tell me I've got to do this or that. I mean, you could marry a tree, say do whatever you want with the tree. I mean, you could fly to the moon. I don't care. You do what you do. Just leave
Right.
me out of it.
Yeah.
And that's how it was when I was growing up. You know what I mean? It's like, hey man, whatever your neighbor does, as long as they're not bothering you, leave them alone. That's how it was here in Michigan, right? I mean, Michigan's a very, they call us a swing state, right? Because one cycle we're Republican, one cycle we're Democrat. You know, it's it's weird because a lot of the UAW here, the UAW officially endorsed Biden, but I can tell you the vast majority of their workforce that I've come in contact with, and I know some people who take work with them. Vast majority of them voted for Trump because they literally felt he was the only person that was going to bring their jobs back. And then last week or the week before, GM says, "Yeah, we're bringing production of 3 models back to the United States." And that that's significant, because these auto workers here, they make good money. Those are middle class jobs. These, if you're an auto worker, especially with the new contract, and you got 40 something dollars an hour, and let's say a car is in high demand, right? And you're working 12-hour days, 5-6 days a week, you're clearing over 100 something thousand dollars a year, which I know in California is like minimum wage. Joke.
It's like poverty level,
Right. But here that's like,
which is
that's
totally sad, right? I mean, that's horrible. That's a whole nother conversation.
right. I mean, but here that's like, that's really good money. The cost of living in Michigan is very, very affordable. And, so you got these guys, that make this good money. So when you got somebody like the current president says, "Hey, I know this might be painful, but we're going to take these companies to task. We're going to take them to town. We're going to work on getting you back the things that these companies took from here, but promised you they would do other things." The reason why Detroit doesn't have a metro, like a rail like Chicago, I believe LA has one as well, New York subway, is I believe in the 70s. I don't remember the exact wording, but the car companies essentially said, "Yeah, we'll take care of Detroit. It's the cars, this, that, and the other thing." And then, as more free trade opened up, they were like deuces and started closing all the factories. And it was, the Detroit turned the money down. They did end up building the people mover in downtown Detroit that goes like 5 blocks. It's a little bit longer than that, but it's really pretty much, unless you do business downtown, it's kind of pointless. There's always been these grand talks of, yeah, we want to build, these things out on the major ways. There was all this talk about between Detroit and Ann Arbor, we want to build these, this train, they can get you there in like 15 minutes type of thing. None of it ever came to fruition. And then when you look at the groups that are opposing it and who's donating to the groups, is the car companies. The car companies are funneling money to some of these groups. And I'm like, well, man, to be fair to Ford Motor Company, they have rebuilt a lot of, like, a good section of Detroit called Corktown. It was the old train station in Detroit. If you've seen a video of any Detroit, like in the ruins type of thing, I guarantee you've seen the train depot. It's like the icon of Detroit ruin. And a couple of years ago, Bill Ford, which is Henry Ford's grandson, said, "Hey, we're buying the old train depot from the city of Detroit. I think it's like $1 to $2 billion. We're going to restore it, and then we're going to restore the whole neighborhood around it." And now they're talking about building a little hotel or something near there. And they're almost, they're probably, I believe the train station opens up completely this fall, but it's going to be like engineers, and it's not, but now Amtrak's talking about, well, we want to build a hub next door to it now and bring back the trains coming through here. And, so the Ford family has done some stuff to kind of bring things back to Detroit. I'll give them that, but they were also kind of on that bandwagon that abandoned ship for a while.
Yeah, it's funny you mentioned LA and a rail system, which I think they do, like you say, now have some rail down there, but they've always sort of been known as not having very good rail in LA and Southern California. And there's a whole sort of conspiracy theory, and it has some basis in fact about that. I don't know if you know that history of that, but like GM bought some bus company, and then that bus company bought, like the streetcars, and then shut them down and stuff like that, because like you say, it was kind of like to try to get automobiles. But and it's not 100% the only reason why that LA's big geographically, and train system's hard to do there and all that kind of stuff. So there's a bunch of other factors than that. But yeah, there's a whole conspiracy theory about how the auto industry killed the streetcars. They had a streetcar system in LA, and they killed it in like the 30s or something like that.
Yeah, they did that here. They killed that in, I believe, the 50s is when that stuff kind of started wrapping up. And as the rest of America, a lot of big cities were going, well, yeah, let's put these rails in, and it'll ease congestion. It'll make the roads easier to maintain. It's going to save money over the long run. And it's like everybody here in Michigan was like, "Oh, hey, whoa, we don't do that here." It was, it's like it's crazy. My uncle that grew up here, but now he lives in Minneapolis, and he goes, "The only problem with Michigan is it's a one-trick pony." For a long time, it's all it was, is Michigan went the way the auto companies went. We're a lot more diversified now. There is a lot more going on here than there used to be. They're opening up a hydrogen plant here where to produce hydrogen for hydrogen cars. Whereas before, we were pretty much locked in just oil, certain things, right? It's still tied to the automotive industry, but it's producing liquid hydrogen for experimental things, which can grow out, do things like that. I know you're in California, and I know electric cars are huge there. I know, that's pretty much the biggest market in the United States for them. Uh, but like in the north here, where we have winters, I mean, your electric car, the battery capacity just shrinks. So here, I think like a hydrogen powered vehicle would do better here because I get that hydrogen is a little bit more expensive right now, but to be fair, hydrogen also hasn't had the amount of money electric has to become efficient. But I feel like in the north, full blown electric cars like California has just is not something that's realistic.
The it's always kind of bothered me that at one time I was kind of a physicist, but I haven't been doing that, haven't done that work in a long time. But so I understand a little bit of the physics around some of this. But all these people that would basically, are basically out there. Well, EVs are a solution to all problems. Like, and I'm not against EVs in the sense that they have a place in all this. We probably need to try all this stuff because at some point we really are going to run out of burnt up dinosaurs. But you know, EVs aren't our solution to all problems. Like they have their place, whatever. That don't. I'm not saying don't do it, but boy, to just say like, oh, electric cars, problem solved, it's just like super frustrating.
It reminds me of what the late '90s, early 2000s, when everybody was, well, the way we can extend our oil and save our environment is ethanol. That flopped really fast. Yeah, that would just went poop. You got these gas stations that still have E85, and you know it's like one pump. You never see anybody at that pump. It's always just ghost town. So, but yeah, it's got to be a multi-factor thing because even in before electric cars really started coming around again, you already had a multi-factor system, right? You had diesel, you had gasoline, and then a lot of like carts that manufacturing plants, baseball fields, they would use to drive around to do things. A lot of those were battery powered already. So we already kind of had that going on. Now it's just changing how we're going to do the same process. And I think people just got to remember it's, because right now, if you say, well, I don't always agree with electric cars, well, you want to kill the environment. No, no, actually, I
Right.
don't.
Oh man, yeah. There's another example of like, yeah, there's so much of this that everybody's just these ideological purity kind of ideas, that we just got to get out of that and get our head out of that because nobody has everything right. And and those kind of things just get us in trouble all the time, whether it's electric cars or yeah, something else in the environment, or because I eat meat and I'm a bad person, want to destroy the planet. It's like we that's not going to help us get anywhere if we're just that's the attitude that we have everywhere. I mean, we have to be more realistic, more practical about these things.
And there's a lot of opportunity out there, and there's a lot of people that do it. But like we were talking about the media, but the media doesn't want to cover those ones because it's not going to get the juice that they're wanting out of a certain. But there is a lot of options for just everything from A to Z. There's level-headed politicians. There's level-headed business people.
Right, and it's
Those are the
hard to
ones that
stand
get the
above it.
attention.
Yeah, it's hard to stand out and get, like you say, get the attention out there. It's like a show like mine. I'm not yelling and screaming. I'm not starting debates and getting people all riled up about, my side is the best side and I've got the best ideas. And so a show like that is probably always going to be a little bit more limited, right? It's never going to just go crazy viral because unless I really screw something up, I'm not really going to have a viral moment on my show, right? I mean, I consider doing that kind of is like a radical move. You know what I mean? It's like it is the courageous radical move to not be screaming all the time and to not try to take these positions. But that's not what really works on social media, right?
Yeah, but I think is, I think with like the younger generation, I definitely think that they're, I want to say misunderstood, but I think their political views are misrepresented. Conservatism is on the rise in young men and some young women. It really is on the rise, a lot more than liberalism was 10 years ago. This generation, while they still, agree with a lot of liberal principles, like gay marriage, things that all completely open with it, but a lot of their politics are steering hard right on a lot of other issues. And it's very, I don't want to say weird to see, right? But it's very like, I've got a 15-year-old high school, and I mean, by some definitions, I guess you could call him woke, but he's really not woke because he's not like throwing it in your face, no nothing. But he also goes to church, head of his youth group. and he's Pentecostal, which, that's kind of like those two things do not blend. But, then he also goes, well, I don't really like taxes. He goes, there he goes, he looks at our roads here in Michigan. He goes, man, they charge us a lot of taxes. These things are crap. And I'm like, and so he just kind of, with that stuff, he kind of just leans to the right, and I, the more I meet some of his friends, things like that, and I just hear them talk, right? I'm like, man, this is not what, when you turn on TV, all you see is, oh, anybody under the age of like 40 is just a left wing liberal nut job, is how they try to bill it. And I'm like, and then I seen the results from the election, right? A lot of men over between ages of like 18 and up pretty much all leaned far right this election. Yeah, I mean, and that comes from a lot of them were just chastised for, being men in the last election cycle. I'm not sure what brought that on or why anybody would ever think that's a good idea. No matter your views, just chastising somebody for being one gender is just, I mean, if you're trying to lose an election, that's a surefire way to do it.
Yeah, right. Yeah, I've been working on an episode about this topic for like over a year. I mean, it's been kind of brewing, and I think I have most of the parts to put it together now. But it's been a complicated and long story. But yeah, yeah, 100%. That's not a good way to win an election. But and I think there's some many reasons for that. Like I mean, I think if you think about younger generations, you could argue that boomers and even Gen X and maybe even millennials to one degree or another, kind of depending on where they are in their life, can kind of feel like they got a little bit of the American dream, like they have a taste of the American
Yes.
dream somewhere along their lives, right? And I think if you go to Gen Z or you go to Gen Alpha, or they're like, no, we did not get a taste of them. And for many, especially younger millennials, they feel the same way, like we did not get a serious taste of the American dream. And so, and I think you have this situation where Democrats are standing up going, we're the revolutionaries, we're the progressives, we're going to take us in new places. But well, then what's your plan to these new places? Because it seems like you're just trying to keep us in the same old place, right? It's almost like there's a role reversal, that Democrats are the ones kind of saying, let's go back to the way things were, and Republicans are sort of saying, well, here's what this new future looks like. Maybe you don't like it, I don't know, you don't have to agree with it, but at least they're saying there's something, right? And I think for young people, they're saying, well, these guys want to do something different, and I think that's, with Trump in particular, I think that's a piece of it, right? He's out there saying he's going to do something different. I may not like it, but I'm sort of willing to take a chance on him, because at least it's something. Like, Democrats aren't offering me anything. They're just saying they're going to keep things the same as long as they can. Well, that's not helping me. I don't need, Chuck Schumer's and Nancy Pelosi's forever. I need some new
Right.
faces and some new blood, right?
Yeah, I feel like we're kind of, so I believe, what was it, the 1960s, they called it the Great Switch, when Democrats and Republicans kind of flip flopped. I feel like we're in the same process again to a degree on certain issues, like where the parties are flipping around again. And I feel like like the party itself in certain areas, the Republican Party is getting a little bit back more towards what it was, right? Where like Eisenhower, I mean, while he was Republican, he was pretty progressive on trying to move the nation forward, right? But he was still Republican, adhered to his principles. But he got the freeway system built. Back then that was a really progressive idea. And so I feel like the Republicans are starting to lean that way a little bit more than they used to. And not that Democrats are leaning towards the Jim Crow South or anything of that nature, but they're definitely, to me, I feel like they're leaning towards the people who don't view the things the way that they do. And a lot of Republicans are, but Democrats seem to be a little bit more vocal about it than they used to be. That's kind of always been there between both parties, right? But now it just seems like it's a little bit more in the open with them than it used to be, because certain areas have made them feel empowered, right? Where Republicans feel empowered on Fox News. Well, there's a whole lot more other outlets out there that empower Democrats than there are that empower Republicans. So Republicans seem to have figured out, well, we know that avenue is not going to work for us. So what we're going to do is we're going to beat them at their own game. And I mean, in a lot of ways, they have. I had told people that in some of my podcasts, everybody's critical of the Supreme Court being conservative, this, that, and the other thing. And I'm like, but if you really read what the Supreme Court's saying when they're overturning certain things and they're doing it, they're saying these are acts that should be done by Congress, not by us. And everybody wants to forget that, but they all want to listen to the congressman. Oh, look, the conservative court, they hurt you and get you scared. And it's like Roe v. Wade when it was overturned. I mean, I think that abortion should be something that people have the choice to do. I don't believe it's my place to tell someone to do it or not. I would never ask a girl to do it, or my wife, but that aside, They also said in the majority opinion, this should be an act of Congress so that it can't, essentially, in so many words, it can't be subject to every lawsuit under the sun when somebody gets upset. This needs to be an act of Congress that's essentially validated by the Supreme Court, and that's the end of it. And then and at the time, well, Democrats controlled the House, the Senate, and the executive when that happened. And they did absolutely nothing to address it.
Yeah, and I think that's a big factor too, that I think as Americans we don't understand enough about how our system was designed, and and Congress is very guilty. And again, we've been a part to it because we've sort of enabled it to and given him the way to do it. But Congress has basically just slowly handed off their power, and sometimes because they don't want it to a degree, right? Because if they can blame the president, this is great. This makes my job easier, right? If I do stuff, I'm going to be like accountable to the stuff I do. So they've kind of just handed off, like they should be like, if you're going to say there was a bunch of fraud and we need to do these things, well, that's Congress's job to that, like they do oversight, like that's their thing. They're supposed to have power of the purse, like that. What you're saying then is that Congress is not doing their job, and and I get it, and that's why people are saying, well, then we need something like Doge because Congress is not doing their job. And I think this is another reason why you're seeing all these. Trump's not the first executive to do this, but Trump has taken it maybe to another level of sort of doing all these things with executive orders and trying to take on. There's this whole what do they call it? The thing about the theory about giving the executive even more power. Basically, it's sort of like an imperial presidency kind of idea, and Trump is trying to run with it. And the reason why you're seeing that is because it's sort of like we, the people, have sort of said, I guess that's how we want it to work. And Congress, I don't know how you get Congress now at this point to take back that power, because with that power comes responsibility, and they don't want responsibility, and we're not making them take it. Like, you should be responsible. This is on you. Like, Congress, you did this. You broke this.
Right. And definitely, like, I think they teach kids the basics of this stuff in school, but I don't think they really teach them the process and how it works. They give them the basic idea of Congress passes a law, president signs it, people sue, and it goes to the Supreme Court. They just give them a very big generalization. And where I really learned about, I won't say like a lack of education, because I'm not knocking any teacher out there. My mother-in-law was a teacher pretty much her whole career. But they, World War II comes to mind, right? And then I think of Walter von Braun. A lot of people in this country, you talk to kids, they have no idea where he came from. They're completely clueless. And I'm like, they didn't teach that in school? And they're like, no. And I'm like, man. I'm like, if people actually truly knew, like the history of Europe during World War II, it wasn't as cut and dry as it seems, as our history books here make it out to be. Originally Germany was seen as a buffer between the West and Russia, or at the time they called it the Bolsheviks. That was what they were seen as, right? So everybody kind of looked the other way, because they're like, well, one crazy guy get the other crazy guy out. So they just kind of shrug their shoulders, but they don't really teach that part. And I think it's important that they need to teach these things, because that's the only way you're going to learn not to make the same mistake twice. But they just teach it as Europe is at war, at least here, Europe is at war, crazy stuff, bad people, America came in, saved the day, and then the rest is history. And it's like, oh man, if it was only that easy. Majority of Americans until Pearl Harbor, both sides completely resisted the idea.
Right. There was a very strong movement, anti-war movement, or isolationist kind of movement at that time, which raises all those conspiracy theories about Pearl Harbor and all that too, right?
Oh yeah, I've heard.
But yeah, and I think the other aspect, talking about sort of teaching Americans some of this stuff, there's also like these kind of nuts and bolts practical sides of it that don't get taught very well, right? I have a good friend of the show is a political scientist and he teaches at a pretty conservative school, or he considers himself centrist, or center right, I think is where he puts himself. But he's a good friend of the show and often helps me understand things from different perspectives. And he talks about, in his political science and working with these are college age students, right, just coming in, and he basically tells them on like the first day of class, like, America was made not to work. It's made to not get things done, because the idea is it's hard to get things done in this system, and it's on purpose. Like, it's supposed to be hard to get things done, like we sort of talked about in the beginning, because you have to find compromise, right? They don't want kind of a minority rule or even majority rule system, right? They didn't want that. They wanted a system where you had to reach consensus, and you had to find compromise and this kind of stuff. And that's the system they wanted, and they made it really hard to get things done. And then we as citizens get really frustrated when it's hard to get things done.
Oh yeah,
But we have to understand that's kind of how the system was designed.
yeah, no, it is, and I think that's part of what the problem is. Like, I know a lot of people want to get rid of the electoral college, and I can get both points, right? But when I talk to younger people about it, they really don't understand how it works. They
Or
just
what
go,
the
well,
alternative, like
yeah,
every solution you're going to come up with is going to have, compromises somewhere, right? It's not going to be there's no magical solution that would solve all the problems that the electoral college tried to solve and all the problems that electoral college
right,
creates, right? They're all going to have some kind of a compromise involved in them, right? There's going to be an upside and downside.
right. Well, it just goes to show schools don't really teach much about the Federalist Papers. And the reason why we went down the road we did, right? Because the downside to not having that and only going popular is, well, I mean, states like California, New York, Texas pretty much just determine every election.
Not only
Everybody
just those
else
states,
doesn't.
it's less than that because even
The
California has a
cities, the
pretty
big city
substantial
elections, right?
red section within California, right? Up north, it's the Central Valley is pretty red. Some of the south part is pretty red. Some of the southeast part is pretty red. But yeah, it would be like L.A., San Francisco, New York, Chicago, a few others, Atlanta, a few other cities would pretty much, like you say. I mean, it's the GDP. They probably occupy like about 50% of the GDP, and they would occupy about 50% and change of the popular vote too. So, exactly. So you'd have to do something about that. Like you probably wouldn't want that to be the way it would be forever. It's not really fair to the rural communities, all this kind of stuff, right? So yeah. So what's this solution you're going to have that is better and still doesn't introduce new problems that from what you already have? So yeah, and also you have to remember, I think the electoral college is a perfect example. I did an episode about this as well, that of the real world we live in. Like proposals to change the electoral colleges it's like the most proposals of any other provision in the Constitution to change. It's had the most proposed ideas to change it. None of them over the history, of the Constitution, and like none of them have succeeded to go anywhere. And it's literally because it's really hard to change the Constitution, right? And so if anything is even slightly seen as partisan, it's not going to happen, right? So it's in the world we're in now, like there's probably no scenario that you could change the Constitution. Now I say that knowing that things can change. Like we aren't always in the same scenario. Things like, what's the old line? Things change. Things are the same until they change really fast. They don't change at all until they change really fast. So there are things that things could change in some way or another. I don't know. A lot of different ways, right? But if things are sort of the way they've been for the last 25 years, something to change the it's not practical. All these people out there screaming with a sign, change the electric. It's not going to happen, buddy. It's just not going to happen.
Yeah, not that way. It just it doesn't. The number one way to me, the average American can really work on change long term is instill your values in your children and with the people around you. That's how you really start implementing the change from the ground up. I mean, in business, it's the top down, right? Business says because of its management, but in this country, we succeed from the ground up
It's
because
always been, yeah.
yeah, and I don't, and I think the problem is we've come to, and not a knock on JFK at all, because I mean, great president, but I feel like that mentality has came to like, man, this person can really, in FDR, right? They can really save us. They're really, man, they're going to do it. And I feel like that kind of it just kind of went that way, and it stayed that way, that if we have that guy, everything will be better.
Yeah, and there could be a shift. Like maybe that's the way we're going. I mean, maybe we're going to have an imperial presidency for a while and see how it plays out. I don't know. I mean,
Oh, yeah,
it's
it seems to go that way because Congress is broken. I mean, the system in Congress right now. I don't know if you ever heard of Justin Amash.
a little
He
bit.
was one. He was one. I think the only Republican or one of like two or three that voted to impeach President Trump. And then after he did that, obviously the GOP pretty much kicked him out the door, and he changed to the Libertarian Party. And but he said, he goes, like on his Twitter back then, he goes, if you really want to know how the House works, nothing happens without the Speaker. And it was supposed to, I forget the exact process, right? But it was supposed to be, hey, if you did ABC, you could bring your bill to the floor for debate or in a subcommittee. Well, pretty much now, unless the House Speaker is all about it, your bill will never even see the light of day among your fellow congressmen, or congresswomen. Like it's pretty much just dead in the water. You got a better chance of lighting it on fire and getting something out of that. And that was like really eye opening. I'm like, everyone, like we talked about Imperial's presidency. Well, the House of Representatives is pretty much king or queen. Everybody else does as they say to a degree.
Yeah, yeah. It really is. Things are pretty broken. And like you say, though, I totally agree that bottom up is how things change here, right? So whether that's like you say, literally just raising your kids with some good values, can also you can get involved locally in some of your local politics. That's often a lot easier, and you can have a lot more effect there. And you also have your churches, you have other local organizations that you can get involved with. But yeah, that is 100%. If you think of any of these larger movements that ultimately achieved change, it was much more from the bottom up. Like there was nobody, you know, at in Congress, saying we need a 40-hour work week, right? That didn't come that way. It came with
No,
fighting on the streets.
yeah, gosh, Henry Ford raised his wage to $5 a day, but everybody's like, oh man, he really did. And it's like, hey, well, I appreciate what he did. Not knocking it one bit. If the unions weren't knocking at the door, he probably would have never done it. And it's not a knock against them. That's called smart business, knowing your audience. Like knowing, hey, if I can get my people to buy these cars, they're going to tell their family to buy these cars. Et cetera, et cetera. They're going to be paid more. They're going to be less likely to unionize. And eventually, UAW pretty much got all the auto companies and part suppliers here are all UAW. But it just goes back to that. It's that's how like a lot of that change came about, right? People wanted shorter work weeks. They didn't want their kids in steel mills at 10 years old getting their face burned off, and the children's right, the women's rights movement, the right to vote. Those all started out at like some local spot. I mean, heck, even our Congress, Sons of Liberty, started in a room. Everything kind of started at that spot. And then it just grows, right? You got to have a bunch of people that sit around going, you know what, yeah, this is a pretty good idea. Let's do it. And then it either works or it doesn't.
Yeah. Well, and it needs a sustained effort, right? I mean, you build those communities up, it spreads, and then it's ongoing. Like you don't change these things overnight. It sometimes can feel like they change overnight because, like I said, once the change starts to happen, it can actually happen. These things that seemed like they were never going to change really fast sometimes, but it still took a long time to get to that point that finally that one catalyst kind of rolled it over the edge and the snowball started to happen. And and I think, and as cynical as I am about a lot of these things, because I spend way too much time sort of on online forums, like just observing how people interact and elsewhere. And of course, I'm involved in a lot of the efforts out there, bridge building efforts, and trying to get people to talk and dialogue and do civic work together and things like that. So as much as I'm a cynic about a lot of that, I kind of have a deeper kind of, optimism that like the better of us will kind of shine through and there will be some movement like that, and I think, a few of the topics we've talked about are some of the drivers for that. I think, you were talking about Detroit and sort of how difficult, the cost of living there. And I think that's a kind of a metaphor for a lot of whether you want to call it the Rust Belt, but also I think throughout a lot of the Midwest and frankly, throughout most of the country, there are similar kinds of things going on. So I think you have that factor in. We talked about how poverty level here in California is like $140,000 or some ridiculous amount. That's not sustainable. That's not realistic. There's
No,
insanity,
not at
right?
all.
So I think those two things kind of combine to like those two things are related in some way. And then I think this idea of kind of bottom up and the young people. We've talked about the young people, and I think those are the things that give me the most hope. That I think all of that's going to somehow coalesce to some kind of a movement, and I hope it's like not towards something really bad and like fire in the sky and this kind of stuff. And I'm kind of counting on that being more of a, I think what's the American kind of essence that I think will bring us out of this. We're the kind of crazy ones. Like we don't do things the normal way. Like we
Yeah,
don't
no,
have to
not at
do it the
all.
way Europe always did it. We don't have to do it the way it's always been done. And I think that essence of America will sort of find a place and really start to bring some of this in, and whatever this new thing looks like, we've got to just go with it because I think I'm past my time. I probably shouldn't have a lot of input on what happens with it, right? But I think that's where whatever this new sort of stasis looks like when all that gets settled out, and I just hope the path to get there is not really rough. I think it's not going to be easy, but I hope it's not, the extreme kind of 100-year wars like we had in Europe.
Right. No, they're as we wrap up here, as we thinking about that, to me, I feel like a lot of the younger kids are a tad bit more when it comes to war and things of that nature. They're a lot more isolationist. They're like kind of like, hey,
Well, and I'm more talking about like Civil War here.
oh, yeah,
I
yeah,
hope the path through this somehow kind of doesn't look like that. Doesn't look like sort of the Reformation, 100-year wars trying to fight over what religion is best.
yeah. The one thing I think they hear that would happen, even if something for whatever reason would ever take us to that point happened, I think once people figured out a lot of their conveniences would vanish, they'd be like, all right, yep, yeah, let's just take care of this thing peacefully. Because I really enjoyed having my Diet Coke yesterday, and the North just kind of took out my supply lines for Diet Coke. Not saying it would be that, right, but it would be something of that nature because we're so accustomed to certain things here that I think that really is what's kept us together without an internal war like that for so long because we're like, hey, wow, we can't stand each other. We do enjoy a lot of these conveniences together.
I like some fried chicken.
Yeah, and it's hey, I mean, like if Texas went to war with Michigan, man, I mean barbecue, I mean we'd be in trouble. Texas has the best barbecue in the nation to me, anyways, from what I've tried. I went to Houston and I was like, man, this is some good stuff. Compared to Michigan, they call it barbecue. They smoke it, and then a lot of places just slap some sauce on it and they put it on a plate. Here you go.
That's funny. Yeah, that's
And
that.
yeah.
That's the war we need. We'll have the barbecue war. That's one I can get behind.
Oh man, yeah, I've watched some of those shows, and I'm going, man. I'm like, you guys are patient. I would,
Oh yeah,
I would,
and some of that is
go
very.
bonkers.
It's so easy to get that wrong. Like you don't have to do very much to
I
screw
know.
that up.
Yeah, one little pinch of that seasoning the wrong way, and you're tasting that thing. You're going, you know, I've barbecued a couple times. I tend to do just more of the, slow cook grilling maybe type of thing. I don't really get too much into the whole smoking the meats for 15 hours. And I've got a lot of friends that do. I'm like, man, you guys have patience. My life is so busy. I don't got time to sit there for 15 hours outside. I wish I did. It would make my life a whole lot easier, but my full-time job is, it's pretty much a 24/7 job. My phone always rings, so it's like I just, I don't have that luxury that they do, and I don't know if I would either way, but I just don't have the patience to sit there for 15 hours watching the brisket get to that temperature to put it on the thing to chill and then changing how it wraps. Yeah, I just want to like kind of cook it for, even if it's a slow cook, and then kind of eat it. I don't really want to go that far with it, and I don't know if that makes me a bad middle-aged dad or not,
Yeah,
but I definitely don't fit that mold,
right.
because in the Midwest, it's pretty much as soon as you're a middle-aged dad, you come home, you get beer, you cook dinner on the smoker. Yeah, I don't fit that bill. I mean, I do cook, and my kids love my cooking because I cook a lot of German food. My son will be like, "Oh, you're cooking? Yeah, I don't care. It's gonna be good." He don't even ask what I'm cooking. He just comes upstairs and eat it. I cook a lot of German food, so it's like, okay, hey, but yeah, I've really enjoyed this, David, and I would definitely love to do another episode because I'm pretty sure, especially with our current administration, they are going to have a lot of things that they're going to kick the dust on and stir up to drive conversation. And I feel like a lot's coming over the horizon, especially with Benjamin Netanyahu. And I guess if you want to say, yeah, I'm not a critic of Israel, I'm a critic of Benjamin Netanyahu. Not a critic of Israel at all. My father-in-law went there. I know several people who are from there, great people. But Benjamin Netanyahu, to me, doesn't even, when you look at how a lot of Israelis think, he doesn't really represent the majority. He represents like a certain section of it, and I feel like he's just I feel like he's on. I don't want to say a witch hunt because that's not the right way to say it, but he's on a mission, but he's taking a nuclear bomb to a fly at the moment. And it's like, hey, I felt they had every right to kind of go in there and do what they did at the beginning. Fair game. What happened? What happened? Yeah, but now, I mean, what are you doing? I mean, Gaza's pretty much just a level playing field with a couple buildings left. I'm really not sure what you're going after because at this point, all you're doing is you're creating. You talk about terrorism. Well, that's just, you don't think them kids watching your parents get blown up aren't going to be upset in 20 years and turn into the same thing you're fighting against? At some point, you got to say enough's enough. We did what we had to do. Go home. And I don't think he recognizes that.
Yeah, like you said about the Trump idea, it's an interesting world out there right now, and certainly, yeah, now he's another one of those players.
Yeah, before this whole Gaza thing, I didn't really have per se an issue with anything he did. I felt, but he had never really went to this degree before. A lot of it was always just rhetoric, and then I'm kind of like, okay, I'm like, yeah, this is how, and depending how you want to look at the Bible and all these other things, this is how really bad wars start. And I'm like, we need peace in the Middle East, not more war. You know,
Yeah,
and I
and I'm
tell a
not
lot
a
of people,
I'm certainly not an expert on that whole region or Netanyahu, but it feels to me like some of what he's doing is kind of like he's on his last legs kind of thing. Like he knows he's not that
yes,
popular. He kind of knows he's sort of in a lame duck ish kind of mode, and he just wants to like do it all while he can kind of thing.
yeah, yeah, and I mean, like, when you see like Israelis talking on non-Israeli television, a lot of them don't toe that hard line that he does. They're like, well, yeah, but and I'm like, okay, I'm like, so it's kind of like, is this guy really representing what his people are? And don't get me wrong, I'm not saying, hey, Israel's got to stand there and get shot. No, nothing of that nature, but I mean, at some point, I mean, you're bombing rubble at this point. Like, what more is there to gain from it? I mean, there's they'll say, well, there's terrorists hiding in the basement of these hospitals. I mean, well, I get it. You're also killing everybody else that's on all the floors of the hospital. Like, let's be real here. Yeah, you got the terrorist, good job, but you also killed like 20, 30 people that had nothing to do with it, that were just trying to get medical care because they were collaborative damage. And so it just is what it is. I just it was just when it comes down to that, I'm just like, man, somebody needs to put a muzzle in Netanyahu. Reel the guy in, something like, somebody in the Israeli government needs to really go, hey, this is going to start hurting us. I mean, before that, the thing with Iran really broke out, Trump had Iran, Saudi Arabia, Israel, and then I believe it was one or two other countries. They were kind of starting to talk about coming to the table to kind of try to sort some things out. The rumors were starting to fly, right? And then all of a sudden, 2, 3 weeks later, boom. And it's like, well, the idea was there. We had it started, and then I don't know if it was just, I don't know. I'm not in these governments, right? So I don't know what they were thinking. Trump had Saudi Arabia, pretty much, hey, yeah, we want to be partners with America again. Whereas Joe Biden, the Saudis and the Iranians have been arch enemies. But I don't know why, however, his policies made Arabia and Iran start kind of doing some joint military exercises together. And I was kind of, then I was like, that's a bad thing for us, because Iran don't like us. The Saudi Arabians, depending who you listen to, they tolerate us for money, type of thing. And if that's the case, well, push comes to shove, Saudi Arabia's got plenty of money. They could cut us off and survive. That would be bad news for us. And so, I was just very odd to see that. And then Trump comes in, they had that big thing, Saudi Arabia standing ovation. They had all these, Middle East leaders there. Then a couple weeks later, all hell breaks loose. And I'm like, man, it really felt like at that moment when he was at that conference in Saudi Arabia, it's like, man, there might be a sliver of a chance for some kind of path forward. Don't know what it's going to look like, but everybody's really kind of thinking about coming to the table, going, hey, we could all make a whole lot more money by coming to the table. And then it just kind of went the other way in, and
Yeah.
I wish I had the solution to solve it, or the answers, or the ability to change it, but our founding fathers did say doing business there is not the best idea. So I'm not saying we don't need to do business there, but we need to recognize that it's not our place to tell them how to live, to me anyways. But and they don't think as we do, and that's fine. It's their home. It's not our business to tell them how to think or act. That's my opinion. I mean, I know there's some people out there, Ted Cruz, sorry, didn't mean to say that name out loud, who thinks we should go into a country that the people that really don't want us to come in there, Iran, and change the regime. And it's like, those people there supported this regime, right? A lot of the older people there kind of helped usher them into power. And you think that going in there and taking them out is going to be, it's going to be a positively, yeah, there's movements there, but nobody there really has enough, seeming to have enough conviction to be willing to put it all on the line to make it happen, like Americans did in the Revolutionary War, right? I mean, they put everything they had on the line, their lives, their homes, everything. Well, apparently it's not bad enough for some of them to want to do that. And that's okay. It's their choice. It's not ours. So And I really wish that that kind of thinking was a little bit more prevalent. You know, respect the way other people live. It doesn't have to be our choice. You know, as long as they're not coming after us, they want to do peaceful business. Live the way you want to live.
Yeah. Yep. 100%.
So, you know, but oops. You know, so again, I appreciate it, David. You know, I've been looking forward to this podcast, you know, for a while.